This is a homily for the 6th Sunday in Ordinary Time. The first reading is from the prophet Jeremiah, chapter 17, verses 5 to 8. The responsorial psalm is taken from Psalm 1. The Gospel for this Sunday comes from the Gospel of St. Luke, chapter 6, verse 17, and verses 20 to 26. To download the text of this homily as a PDF file, go to sundayhomilies.au. We are continuing our journey with Jesus during the Galilean ministry, and in today's Gospel we hear Luke's version of the Beatitudes. But let's look briefly at what has happened immediately prior to today's Gospel. Luke tells us that Jesus went onto a mountain to pray, and he spent the whole night in prayer to God. When day came, he summoned his disciples and chose 12 of them. He called them apostles. Prayer is a constant motif in Luke's Gospel and the Acts of the Apostles, and prayer precedes all the critical moments of Jesus' ministry. The choosing of the 12 is clearly such a moment. The number 12 immediately calls to mind the 12 tribes of Israel. The choice of 12 disciples heralds the beginning of a new Israel. New Testament scholar Tom Wright explains, "The number 12 is itself, of course, full of meaning, as anyone in Jesus' world would recognize. At the heart of what Jesus was up to was his belief that through his work God was at last renewing and restoring Israel, which traditionally had been based upon the 12 tribes. But now the 12 were not just to be a sign that God was restoring Israel, they were to be part of the means by which he was doing so. Jesus then came down the mountain with the 12 and stopped at a piece of level ground, where there was a large crowd of his disciples with a great multitude of people. This brings us to the setting of today's Gospel. Luke sets his version of the Beatitudes epitopou pedinou, which means on a level place. Matthew's version of the Beatitudes is set eis oros, which means on the mountain. For this reason, we usually call this section of Matthew's Gospel the Sermon on the Mount. For Matthew, the mountain is a theological rather than a geographical setting. Just as Moses went up Mount Sinai and received the Torah, Jesus also goes up a mountain, not to abolish the law entrusted to Moses, but to bring it to completion. Jesus is a new and greater Moses. In Luke's Gospel, Jesus then raises his eyes to his disciples and says, "Blessed are you." This brings us to Luke's version of what we traditionally call the Beatitudes. Before we look in closer detail at the Beatitudes, let me again remind you of the importance of the infancy narratives in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. As I've said before, the infancy narratives function somewhat like an orchestral overture. They sound notes that will resonate throughout the Gospel. One such note sounded in Luke's infancy narrative, a note that will reverberate throughout today's Gospel, is that of the great reversal. Let me explain what I mean by the great reversal. In chapter 1 of Luke's Gospel, the angel Gabriel appears to Mary, telling her that she will conceive and bear a son, whom she shall name Jesus. The angel also tells her that her relative Elizabeth has, in her old age, also conceived a son. She, who is said to be barren, is now in her 6th month of pregnancy, for nothing will be impossible with God. Here is the great reversal. She who is barren will give birth to a son. Mary then sets out to the hill country, to a town in Judah, to visit Elizabeth. In Mary's great prayer of praise that we know as the Magnificat, we read, "He has brought down the powerful from their thrones and lifted up the lowly. He has filled the hungry with good things and sent the rich away empty." Luke's portrayal of Mary is emblematic of how God reverses the poverty and powerlessness of the human condition. And this great reversal will resonate again in Luke's account of the Beatitudes. So let us now return to the Beatitudes. In the Gospel of Matthew, 3 chapters are devoted to the Sermon on the Mount. At 109 verses, it is much longer than Luke's account of the Beatitudes, which is only 30 verses in length. Luke's Beatitudes share 29 verses with Matthew. About a further 34 verses from the Sermon on the Mount are found scattered throughout Luke's Gospel in different contexts. And there are about 46 verses in the Sermon on the Mount that have no parallel in Luke's Gospel. So about 58% of Matthew's Sermon on the Mount is found in Luke's Gospel, and about 42% has no parallel in Luke's Gospel. Before we look in closer detail at Luke's version of the Beatitudes, let me again remind you that the lectionary chooses the first reading because in one way or another it complements the theme of the Gospel. Today's first reading comes from the prophet Jeremiah. Today's responsorial psalm is taken from Psalm 1. It also echoes the theme of the first reading and the Gospel. Today's first reading from the prophet Jeremiah, the responsorial psalm, and the Gospel all contrast 2 ways of living. One way of living is blessed. The other is woeful. Let's first turn to the prophet Jeremiah, who begins with those who are cursed. Cursed be anyone who trusts in human beings, who relies on human strength, and whose heart turns away from the Lord. Such a one is like a shrub in the wastelands, living in the parched places of the desert. Blessed is anyone who trusts in the Lord, with the Lord to rely on. Such a one is like a tree by the waterside that thrusts its roots to the stream. The imagery uses 2 trees, one in the desert, in salty soil, the other planted by flowing water, bringing growth, green leaves, and constant fruit. Let's now turn to the psalm. Blessed indeed is the man who follows not the counsel of the wicked, nor stands in the path with sinners, nor sits in the company of scorners, but whose delight is the law of the Lord, and who ponders his law day and night. Such a one is like a tree that is planted beside the flowing waters, that yields its fruit in due season, and whose leaves shall never fade, and all that he does shall prosper. Not so are the wicked, not so, for they like winnowed chaff shall be driven away by the wind. The word blessed is a translation of the Hebrew esher. The Hebrew word esher conveys a state of blessedness. It is often used to describe the condition of those who are in a right relationship with God, experiencing God's favour and guidance. This term is not merely about external circumstances, but reflects an inner joy and contentment that comes from living according to God's will. In ancient Israelite culture, the concept of blessedness was deeply tied to one's relationship with God and adherence to God's commandments. The Israelites believed that true happiness and prosperity were the results of living a life aligned with God's law. This understanding is reflected in the wisdom literature of the Old Testament, where Esher is frequently used to describe the ideal life of a righteous person. The Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible translates Esher as makarios, a word that we'll come to in a moment. The lectionary in use in Australia uses the Jerusalem Bible translation. In the Jerusalem Bible translation, we hear Jesus telling the people, "Happy are you." The Revised New Jerusalem Bible has reverted to the more traditional translation, "Blessed are you." The word blessed is a translation of the Greek makarios. The English word blessed is a far better translation than the word happy, and for this reason. We can thank the Vikings for our English word happy. The root word of the English word happy is the Old Norse word hap, and it meant chance, fortune, or fate. In early Middle English, so from 1100 to 1250, hap acquired the sense of good fortune or good fate. And from that use of good fortune, we get the sense of someone being in a good mood, or what today we would call happy. However, a number of English words that include the Old Norse word hap still reflect the idea of chance, fortune, or fate. Consider these words. Happen. It just happened. I didn't expect it. It came by pure chance. Perhaps. Maybe yes. Maybe no. Who can tell? Haphazard. Dependent on mere chance. Happenstance. Coincidence. It happened by chance. Hapless. Unfortunate. Unlucky. So the root meaning of our English word happy is something that is dependent on chance or luck. If I were going on a picnic and it was overcast, blustery and raining, I'd be unhappy. If it was a lovely sunny day, I'd be happy. Happiness, in other words, is as fickle as the weather. So, the Greek word that we find in the Beatitudes is makarios. Makarios occurs 50 times in the New Testament. We find it 13 times in Matthew's Gospel and 15 times in Luke's Gospel. It's a word that is used almost exclusively in the New Testament of religious joy. New Testament scholar William Barclay tells us that the meaning of makarios can best be seen from one particular usage of it. The Greeks called Cyprus he makaria, the feminine form of the adjective, which means the happy isle. They did so because they believed that Cyprus was so lovely, so rich and so fertile an island that a man would never need to go beyond its coastline to find the perfectly happy life. It had such a climate, such flowers and fruits and trees, such minerals, such natural resources that it contained within itself all the materials for perfect happiness. Makarios then describes that joy which has its secret within itself, that joy which is serene and untouchable, and self-contained, that joy which is completely independent of all the chances and the changes of life. A change in fortune, a collapse in health, the failure of a plan, the disappointment of an ambition, even a change in the weather, can take away the fickle joy the world can give. But the Christian has the serene and untouchable joy which comes from walking forever in the company and in the presence of Jesus Christ. So, some concluding words on Makarios. In ancient Greek culture, Makarios was at first a poetic word and referred to the blessedness of the gods. Later, it came to be used for the freedom of the rich from normal cares and worries. In the New Testament, Makarios is used to describe a state of spiritual well-being. It denotes a serene and untouchable joy, a contentment that comes from living in accordance with God's will. The Beatitudes describe fullness of life, a joy that sorrow and loss and pain and grief are powerless to touch. We now come to the woes. The Jerusalem Bible translation is, "Alas for you." The New Revised Standard Version has, "Woe to you." The Greek word translated as alas or woe is ouai. The Greek word ouai is an interjection used to express deep distress, lamentation, or denunciation. It is often translated as woe or alas in English. In the ancient Near Eastern context, expressions of woe were common in both secular and religious texts. They were used to lament misfortune or impending doom, and were often part of prophetic literature to warn of divine judgment. In the Greco-Roman world, such expressions were understood as serious pronouncements, often linked to the moral and spiritual failings of individuals or societies. In the New Testament, it is frequently used by Jesus to pronounce judgment or express sorrow over the spiritual state of individuals or groups, particularly the Pharisees and cities that rejected his message. So, blessed or woe, Makarios or ouai. Jesus calls 4 groups of people blessed, and he says woe to 4 groups of people. Tom Wright explains. 4 promises and 4 warnings presented in terms of Israel's great scriptural codes. In the book called Deuteronomy, there were long lists of blessings for those who obeyed the law and curses for those who didn't. These form part of the charter, the covenant, the binding agreement between God and Israel. Now, with the renewed Israel formed around him, Jesus gives them his own version of the same thing. Blessed are you who are poor, and woe to you who are rich. Let's consider that word poor. The Greek word is tokoi, or tokos in the singular. We find that same word, tokoi, in Matthew's Sermon on the Mount, but Matthew qualifies tokoi by adding to pneumati, which means in spirit. In other words, Matthew isn't talking about those who are literally destitute. He's talking about the poor in spirit. One can be wealthy, but at the same time poor in spirit. The word tokos comes from the verb toso, meaning to crouch or to cower, which reflects a posture of begging. The tokoi were destitute beggars, the extreme opposite of the rich. They were the economically impoverished and marginalised. They were almost totally dependent upon the generosity of others for sustenance. So Luke's beatitude is directed to those who are literally impoverished. Keep in mind the episode that Luke places at the very beginning of the public ministry of Jesus. Jesus returns to his hometown of Nazareth, and he goes to the synagogue on the Sabbath day. They hand him the scroll of the prophet Isaiah. Jesus then reads these words from the prophet Isaiah. "The Spirit of the Lord has been given to me, for he has anointed me. He has sent me to bring good news to the poor, to proclaim liberty to captives, and to the blind new sight, to set the downtrodden free, to proclaim the Lord's year of favour." Here again we have the great reversal. Captives will be liberated, the blind will see, and the downtrodden will be set free. But note, he has sent me to bring the good news to the poor. And here we have that same word for poor, tokoi. Jesus then rolls up the scroll, gives it back to the assistant, and sits down. Jesus then says, "This text is being fulfilled today, even as you listen." So in Luke's account of the Beatitudes, Jesus returns to this same theme. It is the tokoi, the destitute, who are blessed. How does that make us feel? New Testament scholar Alan Culpepper offers this reflection. Because we are not poor, this beatitude either mystifies us or leaves us feeling guilt rather than joy. Like the rich young ruler, we hear the Lord's word and go away sorrowful because our possessions are many. Our pride and our ability to provide for ourselves have blocked the channels of blessing. Our first response, therefore, needs to be repentance and a reordering of the priorities we have set for our lives. But what a hard thing that is. St. Francis of Assisi is a wonderful example of someone who did, through God's grace, manage that reordering of his priorities. Francis died on the evening of October the 3rd, 1226, alongside the small chapel of the Porziuncula, now enclosed within the Basilica of St. Mary of the Angels. 18 years earlier, on February the 24th, 1208, the feast day of St. Matthias, Francis had attended Mass in the Porziuncula. After the proclamation of the Gospel, Francis said, "This is what I want. This is what I am looking for. This is what I am longing in my inmost heart to do." The reading that so inspired Francis was from chapter 10 of St. Matthew's Gospel, where Jesus sends the disciples forth, telling them, "Provide yourselves with no gold or silver, not even with a few coppers for your purses, with no haversack for the journey, or spare tunic or footwear, or a staff, for the labourer deserves his wages." From the time of his conversion, Francis sought to live a life of poverty, owning nothing, totally dependent upon God. Here, alongside the Porziuncula, you can see a plaque marking the exact place where Francis died. As he lay dying, he asked his brothers to remove his religious habit. He wished to lie naked on the bare soil. G.K. Chesterton described the moment of Francis' death in these words: Francis desired, even in his death agony, to lie bare upon the bare ground, to prove that he had and that he was nothing. And we can say that the stars which passed above that gaunt and wasted corpse, stark upon the rocky floor, had for once in all their shining cycles round the world of labouring humanity looked down upon a happy man. Why did Jesus say, "Woe to those who are rich"? The answer is because they are having their consolation now. Let's focus on that word having. They are having their consolation now. The Greek verb that Luke uses is apechein. This word was a technical term that means giving a receipt for an account that had been paid in full. So the idea is that those who are rich have nothing further to look forward to. They have received payment in full. There is nothing left to have. But it would seem that being paid in full still leaves many people dissatisfied. An article published in London's Telegraph had the headline, "It's official. Money can't buy happiness, but it can bring anxiety." The article quotes figures published by the Office for National Statistics, comparing happiness and household wealth. It would seem that people across Britain are not getting any happier, and they're becoming more anxious despite having more disposable income. Since 2012, the average person in Britain has become 36% wealthier, but only 3% happier. 36% wealthier, but only 3% happier. Some people can never be satisfied, as cartoonist Michael Leunig suggests. The young boy, "I want a tricycle." The teenager, "I want a bicycle." The young man, "I want a motor car." The executive, "I want a motorcade." In 1976, the psychoanalyst and social philosopher Erich Fromm wrote "To Have or To Be." The title describes two different attitudes to wealth and possessions. Some people measure success in terms of what they have. Others measure success in terms of who they are. We live in a society in which the supreme goal is to have, and to have more and more. A society in which the very essence of being is having. If one has nothing, one is nothing. Fromm quotes from two poems to illustrate these two different approaches to life. In each of the poems, the poet encounters a flower. The 19th century English poet Tennyson sees a flower while taking a walk. "Flower in a crannied wall, I pluck you out of the crannies. I hold you here, root and all, in my hand." The 17th century Japanese poet Basho also sees a flower, a nazuna, but his response is quite different. "When I look carefully, I see the nazuna blooming by the hedge." Ah! The difference is striking. Tennyson reacts to the flower by plucking it up, root and all, He wants to have it, to possess it. And of course, the uprooted flower will soon die. The Japanese poet's reaction to the flower is entirely different. He does not want to pluck it. He doesn't even touch it. He is simply transformed by the flower's beauty in a moment of ecstasy. Blessed are you who are hungry now. Woe to you who have your fill now. Blessed are you who weep now. Woe to you who laugh now. Blessed are you when people hate you, drive you out, abuse you. Woe to you when the world speaks well of you. What is happening here? Jesus is making it very clear that the new life of God's kingdom is a complete reversal of the world's values. The standards of the world are turned upside down. Tom Wright describes this great reversal, a note first sounded in the infancy narrative in these words: "It's an upside-down code," or perhaps Jesus might have said a right way up code, instead of the upside-down ones people had been following. God is doing something quite new. As Jesus had emphasized in the synagogue at Nazareth in chapter 4, he is fulfilling his promises at last, and this will mean good news for all the people who haven't had any for a long time: the poor, the hungry, those who weep, those who are hated. Blessings on them. Not that there's anything virtuous about being poor or hungry in itself, but when injustice is reigning, the world will have to be turned once more the right way up for God's justice and kingdom to come to birth. When many people are asked the question, what is the recipe for happiness, they respond with things like prosperity, comfort, peace of mind, and popularity. But what if these reduce our desire for the world to come, if they cut off our sense of dependence on God? We have all we want. We don't need God. Frank Sinatra's signature tune in his latter years was the Paul Anka song, "I Did It My Way," and it is the ultimate expression of self-reliance. I planned each charted course, each careful step along the byway, and more, much more than this, I did it my way. Needless to say, this is not the anthem of the poor, but the siren voice of personal autonomy and self-sufficiency. Today's gospel puts a question mark alongside some of the complacent assumptions that rule our culture. Jesus pronounces his blessing on those who have failed to find their satisfaction in these worldly goals. This is not a blessing upon misfortune. It is not saying that poverty, hunger, grief, and public resentment are something good and desirable. The late English theologian and scripture scholar George Caird tells us succinctly the meaning of the Beatitudes. The advantage belongs to those who approach the kingdom with the greatest need and capacity for its inexhaustible riches, undistracted by the spurious consolations of the world.